Thanks for joining me in a presentation of Ecology Concepts. I'm going to first start by looking through the basics of ecology. And we can define ecology as the scientific study of habitats, populations, and interactions among organisms and their surrounding environment. We talk about ecology in terms of the abiotic or non-living physical and chemical factors, as well as the biotic factors or living things that exist within a specific habitat. In the study of ecology, we can explore organisms based on one of several levels of organization. Ecologists can study organisms on the individual level, so looking at some physiological element or other characteristic of an individual. They can explore the population of a certain species, so interbreeding individuals of the same species that are found in a similar area. Ecologists can also look at a community, which consists of several different species that live within a given area. On the next level up, ecologists can look at and explore topics in the ecosystem level, which consists of all the organisms within a specific ecosystem, and specifically it's going to include a larger look at the biotic and abiotic elements and how they interact with one another within that ecosystem. A biome is going to really encompass all of the ecosystems that are present within a region, and our biosphere example would be Earth for the largest level, which is a bit too broad to really get into too much. We phrase these types of ecology as kind of based on what level of organization the ecologist is studying. So if an ecologist is exploring the individual organism, we call that organismal ecology. Population ecology looks at populations, community ecology, as you can guess, looks at communities, and so on and so forth until we get to landscape ecology, really, which is the larger scale of all of these ecological levels of study. And is going to be looking at the study of energy and matter in organisms and exchange between ecosystems. Ecosystems are, if we define those, are described as a community and the interactions between biotic and abiotic or non-living components in a defined area. In order to function as an ecosystem, there must be some form of interaction between the biotic and abiotic elements. All ecosystems are going to require a constant input of energy, and there's going to be some form of chemical and nutrient cycling that occurs within these regions. And we'll explore that a little bit more shortly. And just to give you an idea of some types of ecosystems that exist on our planet, we have several mentioned here: the tropical rainforest and temperate grasslands and tundra and desert, and all ecosystems that we're relatively familiar with. And these are all the terrestrial-based ones. There's obviously marine ecosystems as well that we can describe and explore. So just delving into a little bit more about the energy and nutrient flow within those ecosystems, we first have to talk about the concept of trophic pyramids and trophic levels. A trophic pyramid is a graphical representation of biomass, so the mass of organisms found at those different levels, and steps into hierarchical levels. Trophic levels are going to consist of organisms that share the same function in the food chain, or the food web, and the same nutritional relationship to the primary sources of energy. In this figure, we have a trophic pyramid with the various trophic levels starting with primary producers along the bottom level of the pyramid. Primary producers are going to consist of plankton and plants and other organisms that derive their energy directly from the sun. Above that are the primary consumers, which are herbivores that are going to feed on the primary producers. Just above the primary consumers are secondary consumers, which are organisms that feed on those primary consumers. And along the top of this pyramid, we find tertiary consumers, which are going to be those consumers of the secondary consumers, and thus have kind of layers of separation from that direct ingestion of primary producers. understanding the energy flow within this trophic pyramid is critical to understanding the efficiency of organisms as well as how they interact. So in this figure, we have something along the lines of a trophic pyramid with our primary producers or plants along the bottom, our herbivores, our small carnivores just above that, and our tertiary consumers or large carnivores along the top. We can see that solar energy is contributing to this energy cycle, and in the figure, the red color is representing energy flowing through the system, and the blue color is representing heat energy that's lost from the system. And you can see that in each stage there is a significant amount of heat that is just lost by way of these processes, metabolic processes and other kind of biochemical processes occurring. So it's important to note and to consider that although there's a large amount of solar energy that's contributing to the starting point on the primary producer level of this trophic pyramid, there's also a large amount of that energy being lost simply due to the processes that allow these organisms to utilize energy. In this figure, we have another representation of an energy pyramid wherein you can see the flow of the amount of consumed energy from the bottom level in the primary producers all the way up to our apex predators. And in general, we find that not only do we have that energy lost as heat in the green kind of icon there, but we also have these percentages that are indicated with the primary producers having 100% of the energy available for their metabolic processes, and the primary consumers having that number drop down to 10%. So it's a pretty dramatic decrease. And essentially what this is representing is a change from the gross energy to the net energy that is able to transfer from those primary producers to those primary consumers. So it's known as the rule of 10. You basically have a very 10% of the energy that's produced at one level is available for the organisms that consume those level of organisms. So our primary consumers are only able to access 10% of the total energy produced by those primary producers. So what is happening to the rest of that 90% of energy? Well, if we take a look at our primary producers, in this figure we have light energy that's being received and essentially going to be converted into a energy or glucose that a plant is able to then use in cellular respiration. So while the plant and those primary producers are going to produce energy in the form of glucose, they are also going to consume quite a bit of it through the process of cellular respiration. And a lot of times the fact that plants actually also require this process of cellular respiration is lost on us. So a large amount of that energy that they produce is going to their own metabolic needs. The remainder of that is transferring to those primary consumers because there's some energy that's just not used up. So that's why we have this overall decrease in the amount of energy that transfers from one trophic level to the next. It's also important to note in this figure, in this pyramid, that we have these decomposers that are utilizing the energy, but they're also recycling nutrients and kind of introducing that back into the system for those primary producers to use. And that gets us into a little bit more about nutrient cycling. So there are various types of nutrient flow that occur within an ecosystem. I'm just going to point out two here with carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling. In carbon cycling, and carbon is going to be a very important element that's used in most macromolecules and constitutes a large percentage of the substances that make organisms. So carbon is going to be, organic carbon I should mention, is going to be present within an organism. Those organisms are going to respire, they're going to breathe and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, as you can see in this figure. And that carbon dioxide is going to be picked up and utilized in the process of photosynthesis. From there, that organic matter, that carbon, is going to be kind of shuffled through the trophic levels at the primary producer level, and the decaying organisms or organisms that are dead, as well as waste products, ultimately are going to end up in the soil, or in the case of a marine environment, along the sediments, and those are going to be broken down into their small elements and utilized in the process of creating cells and making soil more hospitable and whatnot for plants. So we have this carbon cycling that naturally occurs within our ecosystems. However, it's important to note that, and then here we have a little image of a factory here with emissions, carbon emissions. It's important to note that there's only so much carbon that can be kind of soaked up into the system and utilized by the organisms in it. So when you end up with things like lower amounts of species richness or lower biodiversity, ultimately you have less organisms that are able to kind of utilize this carbon and access that whole system. So it's one of the reasons why there's such a big deal surrounding climate change and increases in CO2 emissions, is because of the fact that a lot of it just gets absorbed by the ocean, and that will ultimately result in decreases in pH and things along those lines. As far as nutrient cycling goes, we find a similar kind of image here, or pattern. We have organisms that are going to ingest those primary producers. They are going to either defecate, or they're going to, die, and basically decomposers are going to break them down into smaller pieces. We also find that there is some form of nitrogen-fixing bacteria or nitrogen-fixing organism that is responsible for helping to change nitrogen from one form to the other. And in this particular example, we see nitrogen-fixing soil bacteria taking some of these substances and changing it into nitrates and nitrites. So you have this system of breaking down this nitrogen, which is important for the construction of nucleic acids. So, DNA, and being able to have your cells replicate. Even though it's a smaller element, we don't have as much nitrogen in our bodies. It is quite critical. So you find this process by which sometimes some of these nutrients need to be converted from one form to another, and that's why having some of these forms of bacteria within the sediment or within the soil is going to be critical to allowing that nitrogen to continue cycling through the system and end up in the plants, so that it can then travel up the trophic system. So those decomposers have a very unique role within this whole concept of the trophic pyramid. Now, another thing that's important to note in these ecosystems is that we typically will find that there are certain factors that are called limiting resources, and these are going to be basically responsible for limiting the amount of life that can be supported within a particular ecosystem. Some common limiting resources in various environments consist of water, carbon, nutrients such as nitrogen or phosphorus, light, space or the habitat, the space available for organisms to exist in, dissolved oxygen or carbon dioxide in the case of marine environments, or freshwater or marine environments, and inorganic compounds. So it's important to note that with this energy cycling and nutrient cycling, that there are limits that are created by the amount of those substances that are provided in the system. It's also important to note that organisms are going to require certain conditions in other abiotic factors. And in this example along the bottom, we have pH and temperature that are indicated as two of those abiotic factors that are important in establishing what we call a preferred niche or a preferred range for those organisms to exist in. Now, organisms can oftentimes live slightly out of that optimum range, into what we call zones of physiological stress. However, once they get outside of kind of this marginal region on either side of their preferred kind of conditions, we find that there are zones of intolerance for organisms where they're unable to survive in a specific ecosystem if it has conditions in the abiotic factors that are too far outside of what they can physiologically tolerate. So there's certainly another important element to understanding ecosystems is understanding what those temperature as well as pH and other abiotic factor ranges are and how those shift and change within an ecosystem, either due to natural effects or natural disasters or in the case of anthropogenic influences. And in this particular figure, we have an example of what we call Hutchinson's n-dimensional hypervolume, and oftentimes this figure is another way we can represent kind of the ideal parameters for organisms within an ecosystem. So in this particular figure, we have a 3D kind of image with nitrogen content, carbon content, and phosphorus content being indicated along those different axes, the X, Y, and Z axes. And in the green, we have the conditions that are ideal for the primary producers. The gray indicates the conditions that are ideal for the invertebrates, and the red are conditions that are ideal for vertebrates. So it's interesting to note that there are some organisms that can have larger tolerances or ranges, whereas others are a little bit more restricted, as in our plants or our primary producers in this example here. Next, we're going to focus a little bit on species interactions. There's three kind of general categories of species interactions, one of them being competition, the second being predator-prey interactions, and a third being symbiosis. So first we'll take a look at competition, and in order to do that we need to define a couple terms here. The first is intraspecific, which is going to refer to organisms that compete with members of their own species. We also have the phrase interspecific, which are going to consist of individuals of different species that compete for the same resources, such as food, shelter, and space. And typically speaking, when you have this competition, there is going to be one of two possible outcomes that can exist for these species. One is that one individual will exclude the other, known as competitive exclusion, and the other possibility is that they can coexist, and we have an example of resource partitioning for that. So the first example with competitive exclusion really just means that when there's two predators or two organisms that are competing for those same resources, they oftentimes will be able to do just fine with the resources when there's no competition, such as in the first two figures, which are representing the number of cells of a certain organism, certain bacteria, over the course of a certain period of time. However, in the third figure, when we see both of the species that are growing together in the same tray, we see that one of the species is going to outcompete the other, despite the fact that given the same resources, they would both be successful in surviving. In resource partitioning, what happens is organisms actually find certain regions within a particular habitat wherein they can specialize on specific types of food. So in this particular example, we have a group of birds that exist within wetland regions, and they are able to share that habitat, and all of these organisms are able to survive collectively in close proximity because of the fact that they are sharing the resources, and each of them ultimately will end up feeding on different types of prey. We also need to understand the concept of a niche, which is a specific area where an organism is going to inhabit. Animals evolve over time to fill these niches, and that resource partitioning is a really great example of having very well or very specific niches within a small area. If two species cannot fill the same niche, then competition exclusion will result. Ultimately, two species need to either evolve differences in order to survive in these specific niches, or one of the species will go extinct if they're in the same region and they can't undergo that resource partitioning. We can break that concept of a niche into several different levels. The first is the fundamental niche, which is going to consist of all resources available to a species within a habitat. The second is a little more narrowed down and specific, which is the realized niche. And this is going to be all of the resources that a species actually uses in a habitat. So let's say you go to a breakfast bar, you have all the food possibly available to you that you could want at that breakfast bar, but you're really only interested in the pancakes and the cereal. Those are your realized niche resources. Just as an ecological example, for the Eel River rainbow trout, we have a fundamental niche that includes pools, riffles, aquatic and terrestrial insects. So the niche can consist not only of food resources, but also space resources. But the realized niche of the rainbow trout is going to only include aquatic insects and riffles when the predatory pike minnows are present. So although there's all this space available, they really only occupy this small amount of that region. As another form of species interaction, we have predation, which we're all probably familiar with, where in one species a predator is going to kill another, it's called prey, for food. And organisms that are prey have ways of being able to avoid this. Prey species can avoid predators by having warning coloration, which indicate that they are going to be poisonous, and thus organisms or the predator should stay away. They can also develop camouflage or evolve to have camouflage, which is where their external characteristics are going to blend in with their habitat. So it's one means by which prey can avoid predators. There's a whole host, as you can imagine, developing certain adaptations for escaping the grip of a predator. In symbiosis, which is going to be close and prolonged interactions between organisms of different species, we see that there are a few forms of symbiosis. One is called mutualism, where both species are going to benefit. An example of this is going to be the clownfish and the anemone, which we're all familiar with in Finding Nemo. And in the particular figure here, we have another example of a moray eel and a cleaner wrasse. The cleaner wrasse is a type of fish that's feeding off the particulate matter that occurs on the moray eel, and the moray eel gets bacteria and other kind of microbes cleaned from its skin, which protects it. Another form of symbiosis is commensalism, which is where one species benefits with no apparent effect on the other. And in this particular figure, we have an example of a gray whale and barnacles. So the barnacles are attaching to the organism and they're getting a safe space to exist on, or space in general. And they're also getting, protection by means of this organism, avoiding predators and what have you. But the gray whale has no apparent benefit from this whole relationship. So it's not necessarily benefiting them. And then finally, we have parasitism, which is where one species benefits and the other is harmed. So we've all heard of tapeworm in the guts of organisms, either marine or terrestrial. And all of these have been marine examples, but the same kind of examples can apply in terrestrial environments as well. So the last kind of topic I want to explore here relates to populations, species populations, and their habitat use. And population dynamics is an important element to review and that ecologists kind of study. Essentially, populations can change over time due to the births and immigration, which is where the population will increase, and the deaths and emigration, which is where the population decreases. So understanding what influences that, those increases and decreases in the populations of a certain species or subspecies is critical to understanding why and how populations exist within certain ecosystems. So essentially we'll have the growth of the population of an organism, which is not going to be limited by anything else. And in this equation here along the bottom, we have that factor R, which is going to be the growth rate. That growth rate, which is represented here in this figure, wherein we have number of generations on the x-axis and population size on the y-axis, is going to be a value which basically defines the rate at which that exponential growth occurs. And as you can see in this figure, the steeper that line, the larger that growth rate value. So when there are a greater number of births than deaths in a population, then that R value, or the growth rate, is going to be positive and populations will increase. However, when the flip side is true, when there's a greater number of deaths versus births, then the R value is going to be negative and populations will decrease over time. If we take a look at this in terms of an actual organism, in one population of elephant species, we found that after hunting restrictions were put into place in the 60s, there was a drastic increase in the population, as you can imagine, because the flip side occurred. So there was all these elephants that were being hunted. That hunting stopped within that particular population or within that particular ecosystem, and the population of the elephants shot up because of the fact that there were far more births than deaths. So we see this exponential growth occurring in situations where some form of legal mandate is put into place to protect a species, or conservation is enacted. Another type of descriptor for growth in a species is logistic growth. In this particular example, if we and we've got the equation there for you to reference, but if we take a look at the exponential growth in the blue line in the figure down below, in comparison to the logistic growth, which is in the red line, we see that despite the fact that there can be the same growth rate, eventually that tapers off within logistic growth. And that's because of the fact that we have something called a carrying capacity. So in this particular example of harbor seals, along the x-axis we have the year, and along the y-axis we have the number of seals. And you can see that the populations, or the number of seals, kind of reaches a certain point and then it levels off and stays that way for over a 10-year period in this particular study. The reason for that is because of this carrying capacity, which ultimately is going to consist of a limitation on the maximum population size. This is going to directly relate to the environmental resources that are able to support that population. So for instance, if this population of seal had this particular beach that they hauled out on in order to reproduce on, there's only so much space on that beach, which means that there's only enough room for a certain number of seals. So either if there was some huge spike in the population, either some of those seals would need to leave and find some other space to occupy, and thus form a different population, or there would be a limit to the number of births that would occur within that space. So in that particular example, it would be a space resource that is limiting the organisms from growing beyond a certain number. It can also, however, consist of some type of factor, such as some nutrient or maybe even some food resource. So the other thing to note is that we have density-dependent limiting factors. So this consists of a factor that can limit the growth and a force that is going to affect the size of the population of living things in response to the density of the population, or the number of individuals per unit area. So sometimes you can have organisms that are going to be limited by or they're going to be affected by the density of the population based on the birth rate. So in the top example, we have population density along the x-axis and the birth or death rate per capita in the y-axis. And in this particular one, we have a density-dependent birth rate that decreases over time and a density-dependent death rate that increases per time. So you might have a shift in the the way in which these different birth and death rates occur, which is going to be responsible for how dramatic the change is in the population size. In this particular example, we have a couple different examples of species that are density dependent. So the paramecium at the top is very tightly kind of tied to the carrying capacity. The Daphnia at the bottom left can increase in population for quite some time, and then ultimately that's going to even out. So you can find that there's a spike in the population, but eventually the resources get consumed and there's a little bit of a lag before that population decreases. And in the example to the right hand side with the song sparrow, that graph is a figure of a species that is density independent. So the shifting and movement of the population over time is due to some other factor and not due to some limitation in the environment. We find that there are always going to be changes at the community level of these ecosystems. And one of the concepts that we can look at in terms of understanding those suite of changes is something called succession. This is going to be the process of community change through time. These changes are going to tend to be large and involve complete species changes in occurrence, ending with a more stable climax community. So one kind of element of this is consisting of the primary succession, which is going to be the evolution of a biological community's ecological structure. This is essentially going to consist of a region, an ecosystem that starts with nothing, bare rock, no soil, no plants, nothing. And ultimately through the recruitment of pioneer species, or the establishment of pioneer species, or species that first start to occupy the region, you find that there's better development of the soil, which increases the number of plants that are present. We also then see there be a graduation to intermediate species that are going to occupy the region. And ultimately, we'll find that there's that climax community that'll exist, which is going to be the species that tend to exist there for quite some time. Now, if there's going to be, as there always is, some form of disturbance that occurs, such as a fire or some other ecological event, eventually they kind of go back to scratch in terms of those species being cleared from the region. However, those pioneer species again will resurface and recolonize the region, and that recolonization by plants is typically going to be faster in a secondary succession than in a primary succession. So we see that it takes a lot shorter time period for there to be that shift to that climax community. In the top figure too, we had hundreds of years along the x-axis, and in here you can see that in the course of 5 to 150 years you have those intermediate species, whereas it took quite longer to have that in the primary succession. So although these major disturbances can be quite disastrous to an ecosystem, it doesn't mean that the region isn't completely unable to support living organisms after a short recovery period. The other thing that's interesting is that vegetation succession is going to lead to animal succession. So in the figure at the top, we have a couple different plant regions of plants where we see that we have undamaged plants that exist, or trees that existed in a region for quite some time. Then there was a bunch of those plants or trees that got cut from the area, and over time the trees started to grow and occupy the region again. And along the bottom axis, with these couple different species, the northern red-backed salamander at the top, red-breasted nuthatch, and a couple other organisms, we see that over the course of tens of years, ultimately those species recover within the region. So it does take a bit of time for a community to kind of transition back to that state where there's going to be a plethora of both animal and plant species. Finally, it's good to understand this concept of biodiversity. We hear a lot in the media recently about how there's this loss of biodiversity and how it's concerning to scientists. Biodiversity, or a large number of species that are existing within a region, is going to have several factors that make it ecologically important to the Earth as well as to us. First, it increases the productivity of a region. So the greater the productivity, the more kind of cycling of nutrients such as carbon dioxide, and other substances. It's going to promote soil formation and protection. With soil formation, we have the capability of growing crops as well as organisms having a more kind of productive region again to exist in. Soil formation will also help with the protection of plant roots and things along those lines. We also find that a lot of times contaminant breakdown is an important element to biodiversity. So having this suite of organisms that is able to break down different contaminants within our ecosystems is critical to being able to capture and control that a bit more. Biodiversity is significant for its food resources. So the greater the number of organisms, the greater the amount of variety of food that we have available for not only ourselves, but also for those organisms to persist with these other purposes. And finally, recreation and tourism. While it is, oftentimes considered intrinsic and not necessarily something you can assign a financial gain to, recreation and tourism is a great reason for preserving the biodiversity within an ecosystem. And we can talk about how to measure that biodiversity over different spatial scales, this concept was introduced by Whitaker in 1972. Being able to measure that biodiversity is how we can establish that there are changes over time. So it is quite critical to understand how you evaluate it and how it's assessed. We first can talk about the alpha level of measurement, which is the diversity within an ecosystem, and essentially is going to be the number of species that are present in an ecosystem. Oftentimes we term this the species richness of an ecosystem. We can also measure biodiversity at the beta level, which is where there are changes in the diversity or number of species between two ecosystems. And finally, we have the gamma level, which is the overall diversity for all ecosystems within a region. So in the figure to the right, we have 3 different panels that give you several different examples of this concept. In that ecoregion 1, or the first panel, we have 3 different ecosystems represented by those little mountaintops, and the species represented by the letters. In this particular figure, we can find that the diversity within an ecosystem is going to be slightly lower than the species or the gamma level, which is the overall diversity across all ecosystems in the region. And that beta value is going to consist of changes in that diversity or number of species between the two ecosystems. So if you have a greater number of species that are in one versus the other, you'll have a greater beta value. And if you have that gamma value is really just kind of a cumulative number. So it's just a couple ways that we can measure biodiversity, which again is going to be a critical thing to do in terms of understanding how there are changes in communities over time. So that concludes our presentation on ecology concepts. I hope you've enjoyed the material we've covered.